Shalom, everyone. This week's Parashat is Parashat Nitsavim, Deuteronomy, chapter 29, verse 9, through chapter 30, verse 20. This week's Parashat is leading to the culmination of the Torah. We're reaching the end of the law of Moses, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The law of Moses, which is the bedrock of the faith of Israel and the Bible. In this week's parasha, we find, to the surprise of those who are not so familiar with the Torah, we find the new covenant. That's right, the new covenant. The origin of the concept of the New Testament. However, in this week's parasha, we find the original context of the new covenant. Last week's parasha, Deuteronomy chapter 28, ended with the different curses that would fall upon the people of Israel when they rebel against God, if they are not faithful to cherish His covenant, His commandments. But this week's parasha talks about what happens when the people of Israel return to God in their exile. When the people of Israel, even when exiled from the land of Israel, even when found among the nations, when they turn back to God with all their heart, it says that in that day, God will then visit upon them the blessing. Despite the people of Israel abandoning God's covenant, during all those years, even thousands of years, God did not abandon the covenant. But He will uphold the covenant, even in the far distant future, so that when they return to God, He will return to them with blessing and cancel the curse, and He will place the curse upon their enemies. We also see in this week's parasha, in chapter 29, that the curse doesn't only fall upon the people of Israel as a whole if they rebel as a community, but it also falls upon the individual in accordance with his rebellion against God. But the most shocking thing here, for those not familiar with the Torah, is that when the people of Israel return to God, it says in chapter 30, verse 8, that they will return to God not by following some new religion, not by worshiping a Messiah as God and following new commandments and some new Torah. Rather, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 8, that when the people of Israel in the distant future return to God, they will return to Him by returning to this Torah, to keeping the commandments that Moses is commanding to them in that day. Verse 10 says, the commandments, the statutes that are in this Torah. It cannot be any clearer. Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, it says, and the revealed things are to us and to our children forever, to do all the words of this Torah. Deuteronomy chapter 30 continues, and it says that these commandments, they are not too difficult for you, and they are not across the sea that we should say, who will go and bring it for us? It's not up in the heavens that we should be waiting around for some new revelation to come. No, it's already here. It's the Torah that Moses has given them in that day. It's the commandments that they were commanded in that day. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 8 through 10. The idea that the Torah is too hard for them is coming from a misunderstanding of the Torah. It's coming from Christians who rely upon translations that includes most pastors and priests who do not know the original language, don't understand the context, and in the rare case that they actually study the Torah, they're only studying it through the lens of their preconceived notions about the Torah, through the lens of their misunderstandings of the writings of Paul. So they're just looking to validate what they already think rather than looking at the text for what it actually says. And even if they come with sincerity, they are going to be relying upon Christian translations, which are translated with explicit bias when it comes to certain key passages. One of those biases we see again and again in the book of Deuteronomy, where it translates the Hebrew word im tishma, b'kol, if you will heed the voice, and they will translate it as obey. Now, heeding God does insinuate that you would obey, but there's a difference between obeying and heeding. One can heed yet still make a mistake. There's a difference between heeding someone but yet inadvertently making a mistake and rebelling against a person. Two different concepts. We also see that when they return to God in the distant future, the people of Israel, when they return to God in the distant future, and He circumcises their hearts, that the circumcision of their heart does not mean they're going to abandon the Torah, but they're going to keep that Torah that God gave them that day through Moses. And it says in Deuteronomy chapter 30 that it's not too distant, it's not far, it's not in the heavens, because it's already been given to you and it's in your heart. So here we also see that when the prophets of Israel later on in the Hebrew Bible, such as in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 30 through chapter 31, where it says that new covenant will have a law in their hearts, the fact that the law is in their heart doesn't mean that they're abandoning the commandments that God gave to Moses, because we see the same concept in Deuteronomy chapter 30, that it's in your heart, and yet it says there explicitly that when you return to God, you're going to return to doing the commandments that Moses gave them in that day, not some new religion, not some new revelation. It says lo ba-shamaiyeem, it's not in the heavens that someone in the distant future will have to bring it down. The idea that the new covenant is essentially a new religion, replacing the laws and commandments that God gave to Israel through Moses. This idea stems from, one, unfamiliarity with the Torah, because they hardly ever study it. Two, relying on biased translations. And three, on the idea, the misnomer, that there's just one covenant in the Old Testament, because they call it the Old Testament. So it's a common idea that testament and covenant are interchangeable in Christianity. That's a common idea. So the Old Testament is called the Old Testament singular, so they assume there's just one covenant there. Yet we see explicitly at the beginning of chapter 29 in the book of Deuteronomy that even in the Old Testament there are more than one covenant. There's more than one covenant that God makes with Israel. God made a covenant with Israel at Mount Horeb, another name for the Mount Sinai. And then it says He also has made a covenant with them in Moab, right before they entered into the land of Israel. And in both of these covenants, it's the same commandments. So we see that God making a covenant with Israel, it's a renewing of the same covenant, but it's renewing with a new commitment. So that the covenant that He made with them when they first came out of Israel, they broke with the rebellion of the golden calf. But then God renewed that covenant again in Moab, right before they entered the land of Israel. So you have more than one covenant. And also, if they break this covenant and then they return in the future, it will be the same commandments, but a different covenant, because it's a renewal of the covenant. And that is the original understanding of Jeremiah chapter 30 and 31 in reference to the new covenant, supposedly the basis for the New Testament. Yet even there you will find, in that prophecy, that the Torah still exists. And when you find the new covenant referenced in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, you see that God removes their heart of stone and gives them a heart of flesh and a new spirit to keep His judgments and His commandments. It's not a new religion. God did not give faulty commandments, and God never demanded that we have to uphold His commandments perfectly and never make a mistake, or else we're doomed and the curse falls upon us. No, the curse only falls upon you for breaking his commandment when it's not a mere inadvertent violation, but when it's high-handed rebellion. And God makes distinctions of these sorts of sins and transgressions in the Torah. If one would simply cast aside their biases and their assumptions about the Word of God and read it for what it says. The book of Leviticus makes these distinctions, but people never study it, forgetting that that's the origin of the commandment. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And what was the greatest commandment? You should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And in Deuteronomy chapter 30, it explains it. What does that mean? Keeping his commandments. So this is the love of God, that we should keep his commandments. Sound familiar? And his commandments are not burdensome. They're only burdensome when we try to keep his commandments without our heart being in it. But if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, his commandments are not burdensome. Just as if you love your wife or your children, then doing good deeds for them to their benefit, doing what they desire, assuming it's not going to cause harm for them, that becomes not a burden, but a pleasure. A husband who feels like taking care of his children and his wife is a burden is a husband who does not love his family. If you love God, his commandments are not burdensome. And if they seem impossible to do, well, then there's either an issue with one's perception of what his commandments actually are, or one is exempt, because God does not demand us to love him for more than we're able, but to love him with all of our ability, not more than. Our God is a reasonable God, a God of reason, wisdom, love, kindness, and wisdom. He has no need of giving a new law. Torah Adonai Tmimah Mashivath Nofash. The Torah of the Lord, the law of the Lord, is whole, restoring the soul. Birkat Hashem Alechem. God's blessings be upon you. Shavua Tov.